My story begins here with my mom. In this picture, my mom is 4 years old. Within a year, she would be raped by a male family member and sold to neighboring farm boys for their sexual gratification. These acts of sexual violence would take place for the next 4 years of her life. In rural South Dakota in the early 1940s, and for too many years after, victims of sexual violence like my mom didn't have words like trauma, trauma-informed care, child sexual abuse, or human trafficking. What my mom and other victims had was, shh, don't say anything. Boys will be boys. For too long, victims of sexual violence have had to endure in silence, without proper medical care, and often without justice. Because of the damage done to my mom's body, she hemorrhaged with many periods, lost pregnancies, and by the time she was 42, she had an emergency hysterectomy to save her life. The surgeon told us that when he lifted her female organs out of her body, they fell through his fingers like wet tissue. For too long, victims of sexual violence have had to endure in silence with the trauma in their bodies for a lifetime. Human trafficking is the world's fastest growing criminal enterprise. Worldwide, an estimated 50 million people are victims of human trafficking. Montana is among the most profitable places for commercial sex in the Western United States. In Billings, for instance, a trafficker can sell a 14-year-old girl for $900 an hour. In one illicit massage business in Montana, one female victim worker can generate $3,800 to $18,000 a month for a trafficker. And at one point in Billings, we had more illicit massage businesses per capita than New York City. Labor and sexual exploitation happen everywhere in our country, both urban and rural alike, and online child dangers are growing exponentially. The NASDAQ Verifin 2024 Global Financial Crime Report stated that among the most prevalent crimes fueling trillions of dollars in illicit flow and money laundering activity include drug trafficking, human trafficking, and terrorist financing. The report called out human trafficking as a humanitarian crisis, and that more than $109.1 billion in illicit funds from human trafficking flow through the financial systems in the Americas alone. But before I define human trafficking, let's first talk about what this crime is not. Let's first address the myths of human trafficking. Myth number one, human trafficking is motivated by bias and hate. No, most victims of human trafficking are sold by a family member or someone the victim knows, loves, or trusts. Myth number two, foreigners must be involved. No, most victims of human trafficking in the United States are US citizens. Myth number three, human trafficking is about movement and borders. No, this describes the crime of human smuggling. Human smuggling is a crime against a border. Human trafficking is a crime against a person. Myth number four, all trafficking is sex trafficking. No, human trafficking addresses two main categories, labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And of the two, the one that's more prevalent in the United States is labor trafficking. Myth number five, all victims are minors. No. Studies show that about 50% of domestic human trafficking victims in the United States are minors and about 50% are adults. Myth number six, there must be chains, beatings, or physical restraint. No. While these are methods of force used used in human trafficking, something stronger exists. And I'll get to that in a minute. And finally, myth number 7, victims self-identify. No, victims rarely self-identify. Traffickers are masters of psychological control. Many victims don't understand the laws defining them as victims of human trafficking, and traffickers use this against them. So, what is human trafficking? In 2000, the US Congress passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. For the first time, the United States had a federal law using the words human trafficking. For the first time, victims and survivors like my mom had language to describe the crimes committed against them. Federal law defines human trafficking as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person into commercial sex acts or labor against their will. A commercial sex act is the giving or receiving of anything of value to a person in exchange for a sex act. Things of value may be money, food, clothing, shelter, rent payments, or even drugs. Minors induced into commercial sex are victims of human trafficking regardless of force, fraud, or coercion. Under federal law, minors under the age of 18 cannot give consent to commercial sex. There is no such thing as a child prostitute. Victims of human trafficking are controlled using force, which may include beatings, starvation, confinement, rape, torture, forced drug use, or long workdays. Or fraud, which may include false offers of employment, education, or even marriage. Or coercion, which may include threats to the victim or the victim's family, debt bondage, fees that can never be repaid, isolation, shame, blackmail, or even arrest. Coercion is fear. This is what is stronger than chains, beatings, or physical restraints. In the early 2000s, I began volunteering as a court-appointed special advocate, also known as a CASA. Through this experience, I learned that what happened to my mom in the 1940s was happening to children today in the community in which I live. In 2016, I met with federal law enforcement to discuss an idea I had for a human trafficking task force. This task force would focus on community solutions for a community problem. That year, in partnership with federal law enforcement and federal prosecutors, I co-founded the Yellowstone Human Trafficking Task Force. And I'm proud to say that we've grown to be the largest task force in Montana, and we now work at the national and state level as well as locally. Thank you. Our task force is made up of 3 distinct committees: prosecution and law enforcement, prevention and community awareness, and protection and victim services. In the forming of these 3 committees, we brought together different jurisdictions of law enforcement, different victim service providers, and different businesses, faith-based organizations, educational institutions, and community members. Within these 3 committees, shared language began to form. Gaps in services were identified, and educating the public became a priority. When the anti-trafficking movement first began, we often used a 3-legged stool to teach about the different individuals involved in the crime of human trafficking. With this way of teaching, we would show that the legs represented a buyer, a victim, and a trafficker. This way of teaching was wrong. With the imagery of the three-legged stool, we inadvertently presented the idea that the victim was equally responsible for the crimes committed against them as the buyer and the trafficker, and that is wrong. Victims of human trafficking are never responsible for the crimes committed against them. Human trafficking exists because of the buyer and the trafficker, and of the two, the one that fuels this crime is the buyer. The more the anti-trafficking movement listened to victims and survivors of sex trafficking, the more our legal systems understood that sex trafficking is not about sex. It's about violence and control. It's about the loss of freedom. The buyer puts down the money and says, "I own you." But by listening to victims and survivors, a paradigm shift began to happen in our country. More and more law enforcement began to turn their attention away from criminalizing the victim and focusing on the buyer and the trafficker. And more advocates began teaching about ending demand. No buyer means no victim. When we began advocating for the buyer to be arrested and publicly identified, we stirred a hornet's nest. But collectively as a country, we began to acknowledge what victims of sexual violence had been enduring in silence, and we began to improve our laws and our medical care, and we began to have real conversations about female sexual objectification, especially of children. We began protecting the child, not the predator. While it remains important that we continue to teach about reducing the vulnerabilities to becoming a victim of human trafficking, everyone must understand that it is never the responsibility of a child or a vulnerable person to prevent adults from committing acts of sexual violence against them. It is 100% the responsibility of adults not to commit acts of sexual violence. When we began focusing our attention on the buyer, we began to more effectively disrupt and dismantle trafficking operations. And the impact of this change has been significant. Before our task force started in 2016, Montana had one federal conviction on human trafficking. Since 2017, we have now had more than 40 federal convictions on human trafficking or related charges. Online ads selling human beings for sex in Montana have reduced by more than 70%. And with the passage of a city ordinance in Billings, we have effectively shut down many of the illicit massage businesses in Montana. Human trafficking is not a seasonal crime. It doesn't just happen with big events like the Super Bowl. Human trafficking can happen anywhere at any time. If you suspect someone is being trafficked, signs to look for are physical abuse or fatigue, has no control or possession over money or ID, avoids eye contact or interaction with others, is inappropriately dressed for age or weather, defers to someone else to talk for them, or appears to be coached on what to say. Never approach or interrupt a suspected trafficking situation. from a safe distance where you cannot be seen or heard by a suspected trafficker or buyer. In Montana, call the Montana Human Trafficking Hotline at 833-406-STOP. Outside of Montana, call the Homeland Security Investigations Tip Line at 866-347-2434. Key observations to report are approximate ages and number of individuals involved, details of physical appearance, hair color, ethnicity, prominent facial features, tattoos, location of sighting, what you may have heard, vehicle description, make, model, color, license plate. What's most important is that you make that call. The number one vulnerability to a child being trafficked is adults. Adults who commit harm, adults who turn a blind eye, adults who say it's none of my business, adults who enforce silence, or adults who do nothing. It's better to make that call and be wrong than not make that call and be right. Making that call may save someone's life. Like too many victims, my mom never experienced justice for enduring a lifetime of physical, emotional, and mental trauma because of the sexual violence in her childhood. My mom died at 8:10 a.m. on June 22nd, 2022. She died with me kissing her face and my dad and me holding her hands. My mom died knowing she was loved. And I like to think that while she was my beginning, we are all her voice. Thank you. Thank you.